The first time I met Brenda Lockhart, she was standing in the middle of a dirt trail, wearing a neon safety vest and holding a clipboard, demanding that I check in before walking to my own cabin. By the end of the week, she had called a mandatory HOA meeting to vote me off the land. What she didn't know was that I had just bought the entire forest she thought she ran. My name is Caleb Mercer, and at 44 years old, I had finally achieved my dream of owning a massive stretch of wilderness. It was 1,200 acres of mixed pine and cedar in the Hollow Creek Highlands, complete with a rustic cabin I'd been renovating for the past month. I'm a wildlife photographer by trade, a contractor on the side, and I had chosen this location specifically for its isolation. The nearest town was 30 minutes away, and I liked it that way. What I hadn't counted on was Brenda Lockhart, HOA, president of the Pine Valley Estates Vacation Community, amateur forest ranger, and self-appointed gatekeeper of everything within a 5-mile radius. Pine Valley Estates was a collection of about 40 vacation homes nestled in what used to be the southern corner of the forest. The development had been there for 15 years, and apparently, Brenda had been running it like her personal kingdom for the last 7. I'd seen the community during my property walkthrough. A neat little cluster of identical cabins with their HOA-approved brown paint and matching green shutters. They were technically my neighbors, though the nearest house was still a good half-mile from my cabin. The trouble started 3 days after I moved in. I was clearing some deadfall near my cabin when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone clearing their throat behind me. I turned to find a woman in her late 50s wearing what I can only describe as a park ranger costume she'd bought off the internet. She had a clipboard, a whistle around her neck, and an expression that suggested she had just caught me committing a federal crime. She announced in a shrill voice that violated HOA Regulation 7.3, unauthorized forestry activities. I explained calmly that I wasn't part of any HOA, that this was my private property, and that I was simply cleaning up dead branches. She scoffed, and informed me that all properties in the Hollow Creek area fell under the Pine Valley Estates HOA jurisdiction. When I laughed at this claim, her face turned the color of a ripe tomato. She demanded to see my property deed and permit for tree removal. I told her, with barely concealed amusement, that I didn't need a permit to pick up sticks on my own land. She scribbled furiously on her clipboard and said I'd be hearing from the HOA board. I wished her a good day and went back to work, assuming that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next week, I received 3 official-looking notices taped to trees along my driveway. The first was for the unauthorized removal of natural debris. The second was for altering trail aesthetics, which apparently meant I'd moved a fallen log off a path. The third, and this is where it got truly ridiculous, was for installing unapproved birdhouses. I'd put up exactly 2 birdhouses near my cabin, on my own property, for my own enjoyment. Each notice came with increasingly dramatic language about fines, legal action, and the immediate cessation of all activities. They were signed by Brenda Lockhart, president, with an official-looking HOA seal that I'm pretty sure she had made at a print shop. The letterhead listed her as president, secretary, treasurer, and compliance officer, which told me everything I needed to know about how this HOA operated. The situation escalated when I caught her on my property taking photos of my woodpile. I was inside making coffee when I saw her through the window, sneaking around like some sort of suburban spy, photographing my firewood stack from multiple angles. When I stepped outside to confront her, she claimed she was documenting evidence of unauthorized structure building. A woodpile, according to her interpretation of HOA bylaws, constituted an unapproved outdoor storage facility. I told her firmly to get off my property, or I'd call the sheriff. She huffed that the sheriff was a personal friend, and fully supported the HOA's efforts to maintain standards in the community. Then she handed me another notice, this one printed on pink paper, for what she called extreme urgency. It was a summons to appear before the HOA board at their next meeting to address my multiple violations. The meeting was scheduled for that Thursday at 7:00 p.m. in the Pine Valley Estates Community Center, which was really just a converted double-wide trailer with wood paneling and fluorescent lights. I decided to attend, but not for the reasons Brenda expected. I spent the 3 days before the meeting doing some research of my own. First, I drove to the county courthouse and pulled all the property records for the area. What I found was fascinating. The Pine Valley Estates HOA only had legal authority over the 43 properties within their development. Their jurisdiction ended at their property lines, which were clearly marked on the official survey maps. My property, all 1,200 acres of it, was completely separate and had never been part of any HOA agreement. But here's where it got interesting. I had the property lines professionally surveyed, paying extra for a rush job. The surveyor, a friendly guy named Dennis who'd been doing this for 30 years, found something that made him whistle low and shake his head. The Pine Valley Estates HOA had built 3 of its walking trails on my land, not just barely over the line, but in one case, nearly 300 yards into my property. The crown jewel of their trespassing was their community gazebo, a structure they had built 5 years ago for weddings and events. It was sitting pretty as you please, right in the middle of what was legally my forest. Dennis documented everything with GPS coordinates, official markers, and enough legal documentation to make any lawyer salivate. Thursday evening arrived, and I walked into that community center with the rolled-up survey map under my arm and a folder full of documents. The room was packed with about 30 residents, all shooting me curious or hostile looks. Brenda sat at a folding table at the front, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She called the meeting to order with an actual gavel, which she banged with unnecessary force. She announced in her most officious voice that they were here to address the matter of Mr. Mercer's violations and his refusal to comply with HOA standards. Several residents nodded along, clearly used to this kind of theater. When she called me forward to defend myself, I stood slowly and walked to the front of the room. I could see the smug satisfaction on her face, probably imagining she was about to make an example of me. I asked calmly if I could share some documentation with the board. She waved her hand dismissively, saying I could present whatever excuses I wanted, but the violations were clear. That's when I unrolled the survey map, all 3 feet by 4 feet of it, and taped it to the wall behind her. The room went quiet as people leaned forward to see what I'd brought. I pulled out my laser pointer, a nice, dramatic touch I'd planned, and began my presentation. I explained patiently that I was Caleb Mercer, owner of 1,200 acres of forest surrounding Pine Valley Estates. I showed them exactly where my property lines were, highlighting them in green on the map. Then I showed them where their HOA property ended, marked in red. The gap between the two was substantial and undeniable. Brenda sputtered that this was impossible, that the HOA had always maintained those areas. I pulled out the next document, the original HOA charter from 15 years ago, which clearly stated their boundaries. Then I showed them the warranty deed for my property, which predated their development by 50 years. But I wasn't done. I pointed to the 3 trails that crossed onto my land, marking each point where they trespassed. I showed them photos Dennis had taken of HOA trail markers and benches installed on my property. Then I pointed to the gazebo, that beautiful wooden structure they were so proud of, sitting 420 feet inside my property line. The room erupted. Residents were shouting questions. Brenda was banging her gavel, and the other board members were frantically flipping through their own documents. One man asked loudly how this could have happened. I explained that the previous owner of my land, an elderly woman who lived in another state, had never known about the encroachment. She'd inherited the land from her father and never visited. Brenda tried to argue about adverse possession and established use, throwing around legal terms she'd clearly Googled. That's when I pulled out my final document, a letter from my attorney, a brilliant woman named Patricia Sullivan who specialized in property law. The letter outlined in very clear terms that the HOA had been trespassing for years. That adverse possession didn't apply in this case due to the lack of open and notorious use requirements, and that I was prepared to take immediate legal action. I informed the room that, effective immediately, all HOA members were banned from my property. The trails would be closed, the gazebo would be removed, and anyone caught trespassing would be prosecuted. I gave them 72 hours to remove any personal property from the gazebo before my contractors arrived. The meeting descended into chaos. Brenda tried to maintain control, shouting about lawsuits and injunctions, but even her supporters were turning on her. One woman asked pointedly why Brenda had never verified the property lines before building the gazebo. Another demanded to know how much HOA money had been spent on structures built on someone else's land. I left while they were still arguing, but not before posting my first no trespassing sign right on the community center door, with a map showing exactly where my property began. It was petty, but after weeks of harassment, I felt entitled to a little theater of my own. The next morning, I had a crew out installing gates across all 3 trails where they entered my property, big metal gates, with locks, and more no trespassing signs. I also had them install security cameras, partly for legal protection, and partly because I knew Brenda would try something. Sure enough, she showed up that afternoon with the sheriff, a tired-looking man named Deputy Morrison, who'd clearly been dragged into this against his will. She demanded he arrest me for theft of HOA property and violation of easement rights. Deputy Morrison looked at my documents, at the survey markers, and told Brenda in a weary voice that I was within my rights, and she needed to stop calling 911 for civil matters. The gazebo removal was scheduled for Monday. I hired a professional crew who specialized in structure relocation, giving the HOA the option to pay to have it moved to their property. They declined, probably because the quote was $18,000 instead. I had it carefully dismantled and the lumber stacked neatly at the property line for them to collect. Brenda made one last desperate attempt to stop me, filing an emergency injunction on Friday afternoon. The judge threw it out Monday morning, and according to the court clerk who called me later, he actually laughed when he read her claim that I was stealing community resources by enforcing my property rights. The Pine Valley Estates Facebook group, which I'd been monitoring for entertainment purposes, was in full meltdown mode. Posts ranged from fury at losing their hiking trails to demands for Brenda's resignation. Someone leaked that the HOA had spent $40,000 on trail improvements and the gazebo over the years, all on land they didn't own. The calls for accountability were getting louder by the hour. The final blow came when someone discovered that Brenda had been collecting a monthly forest maintenance fee from all residents for the past 5 years, supposedly for trail upkeep and gazebo maintenance. That was almost $30,000 collected for maintaining property that wasn't even theirs. The word embezzlement started getting thrown around, and suddenly Brenda stopped responding to comments. An emergency HOA board meeting was called for the following Wednesday. I didn't attend, but I heard about it from Dennis the surveyor, whose cousin lived in Pine Valley. Apparently, Brenda tried to defend herself for about 10 minutes before the vote of no confidence was called. It was unanimous. Even the 2 board members who'd flanked her at my meeting voted her out, but the consequences didn't stop there. The HOA's insurance company launched an investigation into the misuse of funds, and the state attorney general's office opened a fraud investigation based on complaints from residents. Brenda had to hire a criminal defense attorney, which according to local gossip cost her $15,000 just for the retainer. The investigation revealed she'd been skimming from the maintenance fund for years, using HOA money for personal purchases she claimed were for community improvement. The forensic accountant found receipts for a personal hot tub listed as gazebo, heating equipment, and a vacation to Florida filed as a forestry management conference. In the end, Brenda Lockhart was charged with embezzlement and fraud. She pleaded guilty to avoid jail time, but was sentenced to 5 years probation and ordered to pay restitution of $58,000 to the HOA. When the judge read the sentence, she collapsed into her chair and sobbed that her life was ruined all because of some stupid property lines.